Casio recently dropped the ball with their new small dive watch. The 36mm Duro delivered lower water resistance and worse build quality than its predecessor in a strangely small package for a watch designated for men. Initially, I was just as frustrated as you guys, until I realized something. There was already a viable Duro substitute just waiting to be covered, one that I already had on hand. It's a model that's been around for several years, but for some reason has never received a great deal of online coverage, despite offering incredibly competitive specifications for often a lower retail price. Is this perhaps the most underrated Casio ever? Well, here it is, the MTD-1053D. This model was briefly featured ages ago in my watches under $75 roundup, as from the online listings, it appeared to offer Duro rivaling performance. It even had that smaller case size, making it more accessible than the gargantuan Duro. Could this be the smaller Casio diver that you've been looking for? Well, let's take a closer look, shall we? So my unit was delivered in an old school Casio box. Given this is a slightly older model, it wouldn't surprise me if this is still the standard one you'll receive to this day. Despite this modest packaging, the watch itself looks notably higher quality than some of the terrible stock images would have you believe. I mean, what was this taken with? My grand's smartphone? Anyway, the overall design of the watch is clearly inspired by the Blancpain 50 Fathoms. It's got a similar dial layout with numbers at each 90 degrees, separated by regular hour markers. The hands and bezel are similar too, but overall, this isn't one of those clone homage watches by any stretch. Like the Duro, these markings are still applied, which is nice, and there's a similar raised chapter ring at the circumference as well. The 1053D also maintains a grey sunburst, though it's much subtler than that on the Duro, with this central circular engraving being much more of a prominent inclusion. I think the Duro is the better looking of the two from arm's length. Its Submariner-esque appearance is inherently minimalist, whereas this 1053 looks a touch busy for my taste. Nevertheless, I'd say the latter does look less generic, with more sense of personality and character. The level of brushing and polishing, I'd say, is roughly equal between the two. From side on, the Duro has a more elegant flowing case shape, whereas the 1053 looks clunkier with a strange side panel on the right flank that looks like it's been bolted on separately. Still, you'll have noticed that the lugs on this new option taper more steeply, aiding wearability for those without enormous arms. On that subject, let's run through the sizing. On the Casio website, this is listed as a 42.6mm watch, suggesting it's almost as big as the Duro. In reality, that diameter includes the crown guards. If you've instead been looking for a 40mm diver, you've found it. Discounting the guards and only incorporating that right side bulge, this one measures about 40.5mm, with that reducing down to 39.8 for the bezel alone. With a lug-to-lug of 48mm and a thickness of 11.9, this model is smaller than the Duro in every way, meaning the on-wrist experience is considerably different. The chances of the dreaded overhang are far lower, and most of you watching can probably pull this one off. That said, there are no smaller versions of this timepiece, so those of you with tiny arms like me will still probably be out of luck, but I have to say, it's not a million miles off. Unlike the downsized Duro that I covered recently, the rubbish one, the MTD-1053 hasn't just traded size for performance. It's still got the same 20-bar water resistance rating with an ISO certification, as well as a screwed caseback and threaded crown, making water a non-issue. It's also constructed completely out of 316L stainless steel, whereas some competing divers at this price are made of lesser materials. Essentially, it matches the Duro and smashes most of its main rivals on the spec sheet. This watch is even paired with a reasonable 20mm steel bracelet, which appears to be a custom job for this model specifically from the looks of the vertical lines on the lugs. It's noticeably better than those on most low-tier Casios, though I've not tried the bracelets fitted to some of the newer Duro models, so I can't directly compare them. Despite the applaudable integration, it is held back by the rubbish clasp. This houses a measly 2 micro-adjustment holes, which reduces your chances of finding a good fit considering the large link size. For instance, after sizing, I noticed the watch was a bit too loose, but then after removing a link, it became too tight, and the limited number of micro-adjustment holes, they just weren't enough to make up for it, which is quite frustrating. As you might expect for any cheap watch, these are also only folded links, not solid steel ones. Outside of those bugbears, the only real downside the 1053 has compared to the Duro is the bezel. I mean, it's still decent compared to most others at its price, as it is fully ratcheting, has minimal backplay, and the insert is arguably better looking than that on any of the Duro models. That said, it's tinier, has only 90 clicks, and has an unusual shape that you'll either love or hate. Overall, the bezel on the 44mm Duro is significantly better. Luminescence is reasonable and appears to be the same paint as that on the MTD-1056 with identical performance. Again, this watch uses mineral glass, which is basically the standard at this price. Now, I've got the black version in front of me, which is the only one I could source at the time, but they also make this watch in blue. That one is a little harder to come by, but from the videos I've seen, it looks far less dull and I'd say more interesting. As such, I'd go for that one if I had the choice, but this black one is usually cheaper. So we've compared it to the main Casio Contender. It at least gets pretty close for slightly less money, but how does it stack up versus the other alternatives you might be considering? The only remaining Casio option is probably the MTP-S110, which is a dive style watch that costs around 30% more, but has a useful solar movement. It's a pretty good option in itself, but only offers 100 meters of water resistance and features a fake fixed bezel. Another popular option in this price bracket is the Invicta Pro Diver. The most popular of those is the automatic, which usually costs a chunk more than this Casio. The quartz model is closer in price, but at the time of recording at least it's still 20 to 30% more. I'd say the Pro Diver is better looking and it's got better finishing too, not to mention it also comes in a couple of sizes to better suit your preference. That said, its specs are no better than this Casio, and it houses an unsightly case-engraved logo. It's also just a run-of-the-mill Rolex Submariner clone, whereas the Casio at least offers something slightly more original. A respectable option is the Accurist 7000 series diver, which again has only 100 meters of water resistance, but is sometimes available for even less than the Casio 1053. It's almost as well made too, but it is a bit less detailed. I'd argue it's probably better looking, though it is massive, just like the Duro. And it's also got limited availability outside of the UK. The remaining options are typically fashion brands like Seconda or Sterling, which are typically built worse, or the plethora of Chinese home brand watches which rip off famous watch designs. Those Chinese homages are often as nicely finished as the Casio MTD, if not better, but usually lack ISO certification, so their water performance isn't assured. Some brands have been known to just print all sorts of claims on their watches, many of which simply aren't true. The added 20% VAT on Chinese imports to the UK, introduced in 2021, means the homages are less price competitive than they once were, though they may remain better value in other regions. For virtually no money, this really is a hardy piece of equipment with decent specs, and in person the watch doesn't look super cheap either. In my eyes, this is one of the few underrated Duro alternatives that delivers. If you can find a better diver that's readily available at this sort of price, I'd love to hear it in the comments. For value, I'm giving it a solid 8.4 out of 10. While for looks, a much more modest 6.1. If you want to see why the downsized Duro didn't get my recommendation, check out the video on screen now, where I go into it in full depth. I said at the start, drop the ball, maybe they burst it.